Thanks for joining us. My name is Ken Urban. I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums. If these talks are something you like, we do have a sign-up sheet at the front desk, and if you can just leave your email, and we'll let you know every month when the lectures are coming up, so we can get reminded, because I know I need reminders all the time. But I also want to thank the Laurie Center for the Study of Canada for their partnership in our lecture series. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Through the Between the Lakes Purchase No. 3 Treaty of 1792, the Mississaugas of the Credit ceded to the British Crown over 3 million acres of land between Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples, and this commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Matthew Barrett. Matthew has a PhD from Queen's University and completed his postdoctoral fellowship at the Canadian War Museum in 2021, so not too long ago. He published 2 books in 2022, Scandalous Conduct, Canadian Officer Court-Martials, 1914 to 1945, and Through Their Eyes, A Graphic History of Hill 70 in Canada's First World War. He is now currently the managing editor for the Journal of Canadian Military History. His book is for sale after the lecture, or you can buy it now. I don't think you have to do that. But the book looks amazing, and it's really thick.
It is,
it's a lot of work.
Thanks.
So thank you so much for coming out tonight, Matthew. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Ken. And thank you to the Guelph Civic Museum for hosting this event this evening. And thank to all of you for coming out this evening to hear me speak. I'm honored to speak about my book, Through Their Eyes, which is published by McGill Queen's University Press. I illustrated the book and co-wrote it with fellow historian Robert Engen, who's currently down in Australia at the War College. He was a great collaborator, and he was instrumental in getting the book off the ground. Today I'll speak about the creation and contents of our book. Throughout, I'll be showing you some sample pictures, and it is of course our hope that everyone will be interested to pick up a copy, either for yourself or for someone else. I think it makes a great gift. It's available in hardcover from McGill Queen's directly or from Amazon, and the soft cover is exclusive to chapters, but as Ken mentioned, it's also here at the museum. So as I hope you can see, Through Their Eyes is a different type of history book with nearly 250 full-color illustrated pages. We combine image and text to explore Canada's Great War from multiple perspectives. It is one of the first graphic histories published by University Press in Canada. Graphic histories resemble comic books or graphic novels. However, like any historical study, images, narrative, and arguments are all based on research and documentation to ensure that a factual basis for the work is achieved. For instance, while it's fully illustrated, we include detailed introductions to each chapter and detailed endnotes and references. One of our aims with the book is to develop new approaches to Canadian military history. We seek creative ways to connect readers with an understanding of the First World War, which may appear to some quite distant now more than a century on. There's sometimes also a gulf between an academic book designed for an academic audience and a more public history book designed for the general readership. We hope Through Their Eyes appeals to readers of all ages and those curious about new ways to study and teach history. Many educators have discovered the opportunities of graphic narrative for teaching and engaging students. Graphic novels in classrooms today is notable to the old stigma against comics, which were once dismissed as juvenile and designed as an unsophisticated form of entertainment only for children. Despite the growing acceptance of graphic narrative in education, it's still rare to see an original work of graphic scholarship appear as a peer-reviewed book, such as our title. So why did we take this graphic history approach? Well, in part, it's because of my own personal interest in drawing. I've always liked drawing. I've drawn since I was a kid, and I've always been interested in history, and those two interests sort of reinforced one another. So as I was studying history, I never really viewed my artistic abilities or interests as connected, and it's only once I achieved my PhD that I thought, actually, these two things could be combined. And so that's what we went about with this book. So the three contributions that I think that graphic history can make to our understanding of history is first to create an accessible but critical source that can reach audiences beyond a specialist academic readership. The second is to produce a rich learning resource suitable for classrooms and education. And third, it encourages historians and readers to think more deeply about how we interpret and represent the past. We hope that this form of an innovative graphic history invites readers to reimagine the First World War through the eyes of those who lived it and think deeply about how we visualize, remember, and commemorate the past. Given the vast scope of the war in this book, we have focused on the context surrounding a specific battle, Hill 70, in August 1917. As this is the main focus of the book, it's useful for some background about the battle's place in the wider war effort. In April 1917, Canadian troops had captured Vimy Ridge, but Allied offensives soon stalled across many fronts. To help break the stalemates of trench warfare, the new Canadian Corps commander, Arthur Currie, was tasked with capturing Hill 70, which is a German stronghold near the French industrial town of Lens. Hill 70 is simply a trench map designation. It's for the height that this gentle slope is above sea level, not necessarily much of a hill, but the name stuck, I suppose. The nearby town of Lens had been captured by the Germans in October 1914 during the invasion of France. Almost a year later, in September 1915, during the Battle of Loos, the British Army fought for control of Hill 70, which had since become a fortified German position. The attack failed with tens of thousands of British casualties. 2 years of vicious trench warfare continued before the area would be contested again. In June 1917, Currie was appointed the first Canadian-born commanding officer of the Canadian Corps, and his first assignment was planning the attack on Hill 70. The objective was to capture the hill and divert German reinforcements away from the main British offensive to the north around Ypres and Passchendaele. After securing the hill on August 15th, Canadian troops endured days of shelling, machine gun fire, and poison gas as they repelled relentless enemy counterattacks. Between August 21st and August 25th, 2 Canadian divisions attempted to take the town of Lens itself as well, but they were eventually pushed back. Nevertheless, Canadian troops had secured the high ground, and the Germans never really again contested Hill 70 for the rest of the war. The battle cost about 10,000 Canadian casualties, including 2,000 killed in just 10 days of fighting. The German casualties, meanwhile, amounted to perhaps as much as 25,000. Hill 70 has a more elusive character than some more well-known Canadian battles. That can be found in the fact that it's named for an otherwise nondescript geographic location. The legacy of Hill 70 in the wider war is also complicated. On the one hand, it's an unqualified success by the standards of the Western Front, but it also showed that such achievements came at a tremendous price in human lives. The attempt to take Lens as well failed at similar high cost, and the overall aim to divert German troops, away from Passchendaele was never fully achieved. Likewise, the wider British offensive to the north itself also faltered, and by October 1917, Canadian troops had been transferred to the muddy killing fields of Passchendaele. and during this time, thousands more Canadians would be killed and wounded. Yeah. There we go. In the decades after the war, the Battle of Hill 70 partly faded from Canadian memory as it was caught between the more famous Battle of Vimy Ridge 3 months before and the more infamous Battle of Passchendaele 2 months later. Hill 70 as Canada's forgotten victory has been since corrected through the extraordinary work of the Hill 70 Memorial Project. In fact, this book would not have been possible without the commemorative efforts of the project. There we go. I knew it was going to happen. I'll just leave it. In addition to fundraising for the creation of an impressive monument in France, the Hill 70 Project distributed education kits to schools across Canada. As part of these packages, some years ago, Rob and I created 2 short graphic novel style booklets designed for students. There was a good deal of interest in these type of educational products. So in 2019, Hill 70 Project was generous enough to fund a much more substantial volume, which is the Hill 70 book, published by McGill Queen's. So about the book itself. The book itself is divided into 6 chapters. The first explains my illustrated approach to history and uses examples of wartime photography and painting to consider what constitutes an accurate representation of the war. The second chapter details Currie's appointment as Corps Commander and his challenging role in planning Hill 70. In chapters 3 and 4, we then tell the story of a lieutenant who led a platoon in the attack on Hill 70 and a private who was killed during the fighting in Lens. Lieutenant Brock Chisholm earned the Military Cross at Hill 70, and his name may be familiar because in later life he was Director General of the World Health Organization. Private Frederick Lee was one of the very few Canadians of Chinese ancestry to serve in the infantry. Given limited records about Lee's life and service, we use this chapter to explore how historians piece together a narrative based on beyond archival traces alone. Chapters 5 and 6 then use different historical styles to feature vignettes of several participants from the battle, including the 6 Canadians who received the Victoria Crosses at Hill 70. As the illustrator for this volume, I'll now speak about some of the artistic choices and challenges that I faced in attempting to illustrate the past. When reporting on the Battle of Hill 70, one Toronto Globe correspondent remarked that no artist can paint the horrors of the battlefield or convey in adequate terms, what the fighting in Lens region has meant for the Canadian lads who have gone through it. This reporter correctly noted that no painter could truly represent the experiences of being in battle under fire and gas while surrounded by scenes of carnage and death. At Hill 70, just as in any battle, neither visual arts nor the written word could fully capture the destructive scale of the operations, the deep emotions of the thousands of soldiers, or the personal meaning of their struggles. Yet, in Through Their Eyes, we have attempted to visualize the horrors and heroism of the battle and convey what the fighting meant to a number of individuals. In doing so, we have attempted to use this graphic history to explore how to imagine and interpret the First World War in different art forms from different perspectives. In the book, we argue that representations of the past are not meant to be precise reconstructions. Truth and authenticity are not necessarily found simply in realistic depictions that claim accuracy in every detail. The seeming objectivity of photographs, or even the lifelike realism of highly realistic traditional art, can in fact obscure the uncertainties and unknowns that historians grapple with when trying to convey the complexity of the past. Historians do not simply reconstruct an event only based on available archival traces, such as letters and diaries. They also engage in the creative process of construction, connection, and imagination, based on historical research, to assemble coherent and meaningful narratives. The subjectivity of drawing and the limitation of sequential art to depict individual snapshots visualizes this interpretive research process. The pictures assume greater meaning and context once readers mentally link a series of images with both one another and with the text. The book's introduction opens with one of the more famous photographs of the war, Canadian troops going over the top. You've likely seen this image in all sorts of contexts in media. It's very popularly used in the press as sort of the iconic image of the First World War. Especially it's used around Remembrance Day as, again, that sort of touchstone image that we all have of troops going over the top. In attempting to capture a truthful image of war, photographers and artists work to achieve authenticity in different ways. Canada's official war photographer who took this picture, Ivor Castle, did so by claiming firsthand experiences documenting scenes alongside Canadian troops at or near the front lines. He described his work to imply that it took place under fire. He produced this iconic over-the-top image that appeared to show a genuine action shot. In fact, it was pieced together from photos taken during training exercises. The explosion clouds in the background were superimposed later on. In cutting and combining real photographs to produce the scene, an artist engages in a similar process of imaginative creation, but the final image, in this case, a manufactured photo, could appear realistic enough to leave viewers with the impression that it had been taken at the time of the actual event. This example made me think about why we might call this stitched-together photo a fake, while accepting an artistic interpretation of the battle as an impression. During the war, many soldier artists who experienced the fighting and witnessed the shattered landscape attempted to move away from the realism favored in 19th century military paintings. A good example of the older style is Richard Jack's Second Ypres. For many of the new generation of soldier artists, truth and authenticity could be revealed by modernist abstract designs and emotional expression rather than technical accuracy or lifelike realism. Some art critics at the time expressed a clear preference for realistic and representational art. Arthur Currie himself, likewise, favored traditionally realistic paintings and regarded these abstract methods as, to quote him, freak pictures. So how might my art, in Through Their Eyes, be evaluated by critics such as these? It could be judged by how accurate a picture resembles reality, that is, the past as it was, or at least as we think it was. So to give an example of this process, we begin with a simple black and white sketch. Then we would fill in color, shape, and shadow to give it depth, meaning. Maybe some of the details, though, are slightly off. With enough time and effort, a realistic depiction could be achieved, but every drawing would still fall short of photorealism. So why not replace details with extracts of actual photos? And then why not stop at the guns and the helmets? Why not replace the entire scene with bits of contemporary photos to achieve this realism? We end up with a faked photograph. which may be accurate in small details, but overall the scene is as imagined as the original sketch. I argue that in attempting to get all the details precisely accurate, reaches a point where a drawing must either pass into meticulous photographic realism or retreat into a simpler, more expressive, or even more cartoon style. A comic panel in the style of these fabricated photos might achieve a type of photorealism, but I think a sequence of images would be jarring to the viewer because it confuses the distinction between real and faked. Graphic history emphasizes what readers are viewing is a construction that is informed by historical research and interpretation and assembled to produce a truthful, if not necessarily a realistic scene. In this graphic history, we have attempted to show how we can visualize the war in different artistic styles from different perspectives. Currie's strategic view from high command, a junior officer at the platoon level, 6 Victoria Cross recipients, and an ordinary Canadian like Frederick Lee, and many other lesser-known individuals who did not survive. By provoking questions about historical accuracy, truth, and meaning, this work is both focused on a specific battle of the First World War, as well as interested in expanding the ways that history may be researched, shared, and represented. Combining image and text not only invite readers to consider different ways to interpret history, it also, importantly, I think, helps us to appreciate our own role in connecting, constructing, and imagining the stories of the past that we tell. So I hope that I've shared with everyone prompts you to consider picking up a copy for yourselves. I have to say how pleased I am with the overall design work that McGill Queens put into producing such, in my opinion, a fine volume. But I would also like to mention, I do have another book, which is Scandalous Conduct, and it's available in paperback from UBC Press. This book examines how changing definitions of scandalous behavior in military culture shaped the quintessential honor crime known as conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. It details the circumstances under which hundreds of Canadian officers lost their commissions due to all sorts of offenses, ranging from cowardice and indecency to drunkenness and fraud. Lots of fascinating stories of crime, scandal, and occasional redemption of Canadian ex-officers during both World Wars. And if anyone wants to know more about this book, I'm happy to answer questions that you may have in the question and answer period. So to return to Through Their Eyes, I'd like to conclude with a thought about those who fell at Hill 70 in August 1917. About 2,000 Canadians were killed in the fighting or died of wounds. The bodies of half of this number were lost to the battlefield and never recovered for proper burial. The names on the screen represent those with no known grave. The size of each name signifies the number of soldiers with that name. For instance, Smith, as the largest, represents over 20 soldiers. In total, this page represents 1,000 individuals. I find this image particularly poignant to close on because in recent years, the remains of now 8 Canadians killed at Hill 70 have been found, identified, and reburied in an official war cemetery. Some of you may have seen the recent news about DND's casualty identification program, which has been able to put the names to now 8 Canadians who died at Hill 70. Sometimes lost in the carnage of the war and in the movements of massed armies was that each of these scenes that we depict represented a unique person and story. Throughout the book, we have attempted to combine arts, narrative, and historical research to visualize and personalize the experiences from the Battle of Hill 70, as well as place the individuals and events within the wider context of the war effort. What I hope Through Their Eyes shows is that reimagining and narrating these experiences can give voice to ordinary Canadians who endured a war and battle now 105 years ago. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Yeah.
Did you draw all the pictures, all the
I did.
graphics? Wow.
Yeah. So like in some cases, as I showed with some of the earlier examples, I integrate some photographs and occasional documents as well into the pages, but everything was hand-drawn by me and then scanned in, colorized digitally, and then reproduced in the book. Yes?
To begin, thank you. You have 2 high school teachers in the back who will really appreciate this. Did you face any resistance to this sort of way of telling? Was this an academic struggle on your behalf to get this through? I really appreciate the approach you're taking here. I'm just wondering if the dusty halls were really dusty, or whether or not you were able to kick someone you liked in there, or how was that?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I often face. Because people are interested to know, like, is this new approach being met with resistance from those who maybe are used to the more traditional text-based approach? And I have to say that I didn't face any resistance in going through with McGill Queens. McGill Queens was really enthusiastic about the project. It went through peer review. All the reviewers were quite enthusiastic about it as well. So I haven't faced any resistance through that book. I've also published in Canadian Historical Review, a sort of mix of a traditional article and a graphic article that sort of explains my philosophy of this approach. And that also went through peer review. It didn't really face any sort of critiques. I have attempted in other venues, other journals, to publish and sort of include my own illustrations without making it the explicit part of the article. And in that case, there is more resistance, because I think we're still at a stage where you couldn't just do a graphic history as an article or a book. So part of that needs to be the explanation and justification of why you're doing this approach. So maybe one day we'll get to the stage where you can just kind of unapologetically do a graphic history, but I'm also sort of interested in the philosophy and methodology behind that, so I don't mind having to sort of justify my approach. Yeah?
Your approach seems very interesting to me. I'm just wondering, did you have like any sort of reference that you drew upon? Any kind of inferences?
Yeah, those are like other examples of this work.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And the second part, are there any other people that are doing this sort of work in the industry at this point?
I'll begin the first question.
Yeah.
So I was heavily influenced by, some of you may know, the British war comic Charlie's War. It was popular in the 80s, and that was very influential on sort of my artistic style. His is entirely black and white, but it was sort of the same kind of graphic approach to the war itself that was heavily influential to me. There are some, of course, I'm influenced by the war artists themselves who were doing this work at the time. I'm fascinated by this idea of Richard Jack, who is depicting the First World War in the kind of 19th century style of these kind of grandiose war paintings, and contrast those with new artists like Paul Nash or others who are doing these much more abstract modernist styles as well. So I kind of drew on both how people were depicting the war at the time, and then also how it's being imagined in the years since. And that's something also I touch on in the book, is how influenced we are by these images that we have of the war, based on whether it's a comic book like Charlie's War, or 1917, the movie, or I'm interested in how popular culture sort of seeps into these images that we have, and naturally they would seep into my work as well. There are a number of scholars who are starting to get engaged with graphic history. Sometimes there's still this divide between a traditional academic who might partner with and artist. In my case, I happen to be both. But there's some of the tension between a historian who's used to traditional text-based research, and so they want to be heavily, they want to heavily rely on text and words. And then the artist who says, no, we can actually have the same sort of sophisticated meaning in images alone, or at least with some reduced text. I think there needs to be sort of a balance there. In the States, it's becoming fairly popular. There's a graphic history of the Civil War from maybe about 8 years ago called Battle Lines. That was also influential for me. In Canada, there's, some of you may know of the Graphic History Collective. It seems like labor history is very interested in doing graphic history. I don't know if some of you know the organization Defining Moments Canada. I've done some work for them in the past, and we did a project on the 9-hour movement in the 1870s, and I did a comic approach to that as well. So there's sort of a number of people out there that are working in this space, and it seems to be growing. It seems to be that publishers are becoming much more open to it as well. Oxford University Press has actually their own graphic history series that they've developed. So I think these are great questions, and academics are definitely taking notice. Yeah.
You said that Hill 70 wasn't much of a hill. Why was it so important, and how did the Germans fortify it?
Well, they would have had heavily entrenched pillboxes, machine gun nests. The entire thing was just a maze of trench lines. Its importance came from that it was sort of north of Lens, which was an industrial town that the Germans had occupied at this point for 3 years, so they were sort of able to draw on the coal production that would have happened there as well. Its strategic importance was sort of the tactical importance was to take the hill, so then you could sort of control the lower region of Lens. The strategic importance was it was supposed to draw the Germans away from the north of where the Passchendaele front was. And so the idea was the Canadians take the hill, hold the hill, and then repel relentless German counterattacks, and those reinforcements otherwise would have gone north to Passchendaele. But in the end, from the German sources, it didn't necessarily seem to be the case that they would have pulled troops from the Hill 70 sector if it hadn't been for the Canadian attack anyway. So it's not clear that it achieved its strategic aim. It achieved its tactical aim, though, of taking the hill. And then they pushed a little too far and tried to take the town, which didn't work out. Yeah.
I assume you had access to unit war diaries,
Yeah.
Personal diaries of some who survived, and also the more strategic analyses of the event.
Oh yeah. So we went through the war diaries and all sorts of the operational planning of Currie. But in the 2 chapters I mentioned where we talk about more of a narrative structure of a Lieutenant, Brock Chisholm, and Frederick Lee, that's where we sort of can get into how historians use these limited sources to construct a narrative. So in Chisholm's case, we have this letter that he wrote after the battle to his father, and so we use that to sort of narrate the first half of that chapter. And so the text is designed to complement the imagery that I depict. And we have a fair amount on Brock Chisholm himself. He was a very famous person later in life. So there's an individual who's decorated, becomes an important person. We have sources on him, and we can kind of construct a narrative around his experience that may not have been exactly what he saw, but at least it follows the sources that we have. In Frederick Lee's case, we take a soldier who has a service file, as most do, that is quite thin. It basically states that he deployed to France in February of 1917 and then he dies on October 21st. August 21st, 1917. So, I mean, and that's pretty much all that his service file states about him, that he arrived and then he died. So we'll look at the 47th Battalion, which he served in, that war diary, to sort of understand what was happening in the 6 months or so that he served on the front, and we use that war diary to depict what the battalion would have saw, and we infer that this is what he may have seen as well. There's, for instance, an instance where the Red Baron makes sort of an appearance in the war diary, and then we can speculate that perhaps he saw this as well. But then in the page itself, I acknowledge that this is still speculative, and is this also a case of wanting to connect an unknown individual like Lee to a much more famous individual like the Red Baron? So we use that chapter sort of to tease out how historians can construct a narrative when the sources are so limited. Yes?
How did you color your illustrations? Are they done with watercolors or some other medium?
No, everything was, that part was done digitally. So I still draw out by hand. Artists now have moved to tablets and those sorts of things. I haven't yet. I still use, as a baseline color, MS Paint. It's still a solid program. So I can draw it out by hand, scan it in, turn to black and white, use MS Paint for the baseline color, and then in Photoshop is where you can make it a little more cinematic with.
Use some of your earlier work and bring it forward.
Exactly.
And patch things together.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a comment. We heard that there's some teachers here. I just wanted to say that I believe that what you're doing is really appropriate, because when we look at the picture over the top, we're looking at maybe a man that may have had an average weight of 150 pounds. He's got probably 100 pounds of equipment on him, including a rifle and ammunition, and he may be carrying ammunition for a Lewis gun as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're wearing a wool uniform. I don't think we get the scope of what is reality under those conditions, that they may have also at times been carrying 60 pounds of blood.
Yeah, yeah.
And the way that you can portray it, you can show that and emphasize it, and maybe bring it to the attention of someone in grade 9 or 10 that goes, oh my God,
yeah.
like, what were these folks doing?
Yeah. Well, thanks.
I can appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Much appreciated. Yeah, and I think that is an advantage of taking an illustrated approach, that if you read in text that, this is how much someone was carrying, or this is what the conditions they would have faced, you can maybe imagine it in your own minds, but it's also useful for someone like me and artists to depict it as well. And hopefully that inspires students to think about, well, if this person has depicted it one way, that's not necessarily the only way to depict it. I can depict it a certain way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So following through on this scandalous conduct, it's been well known for a long time that the Germans were very afraid of the Canadians. There was an article which came out recently about how the Canadians would shoot prisoners, would shoot those who were resisting. In other words, the article was particularly pointing out why the Germans were afraid. It was because they knew very well that if they resisted the Canadian attack, the Canadians would not automatically take them prisoner. That's how the Canadians came to feel that was the way to act, was based upon the fact that they were always protecting their comrades. It was the idea of comradeship, which is very powerful and became very dominant in, and always remained within the Canadian military. You always look after the private, and Lily Ridge was the beginning of that. Hill 70 became the next part of why the Germans became very afraid of the Canadians. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's sort of part of the mythos of the Canadian Corps. In fact, to turn back to my role as managing editor of CMH, we published an article on that very topic about the killing of prisoners. I think it was 2 issues ago. So yeah, you should definitely check that out. But in relation, how that relates maybe a bit to my book is, so I look at the courts martial of officers And it's interesting that I know of no court-martial of an officer or another rank for killing of a German, which is sort of an interesting dynamic that, I mean, it's a war crime, and yet I know of no instance of Canadians who were convicted by the roadside. There's a few instances in the Second World War, British officer who is in fact cashiered for slapping a German pilot around who crash landed in the Blitz, and there's sort of a publicity campaign that this is unjust, to kick him out for that. And in fact, he re-enlists in the Canadian Army as a private, and he eventually rises to a major. So yeah, your comment sort of just sparked that in me. Yeah.
When you did the research on Lee, did you ever contact the family or do any research on whether there's any descendants?
There's sort of a separate project that went on through the Hill 70 project of someone in BC named Jack Jin. And so he had sort of his own investigation into finding out more about Frederick Lee. We don't really know about his descendants at all. He was 17 or so when he died, so he wouldn't have had any sort of direct ancestors. So I don't know about any living descendants that he would have, but yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Got me thinking a lot here about our students, because we've been having ongoing discussions about kind of what is an acceptable way for our students to present their learning to us and for us to assess their historiography. So I guess like my question is what aspects of traditional historiography do you think we need to be maintaining here? Because I'm kind of looking at you like a bit of maybe a needed renegade who could shake things up perhaps. And I have lots of students who they would love the opportunity to depict their learning and their research in ways like this. But we're also up against, some traditionalists in our world as well who deem it unfit and not true history, and that's even happening at the high school level. So,
well, I can imagine also an issue is sort of tailoring whatever lesson plan that you can develop to the curriculum that you also have to follow. So maybe that is sort of a restriction in how exactly you can sort of break free of a more traditional historiographic approach. But I think that it's a good way to think about what's the purpose of teaching students history. Is it simply to familiarize themselves with this sort of grand national narrative? Is it designed to introduce them to facts and dates and important people? Or is it maybe a way of thinking historically and thinking about how we study the past? In which case, it's maybe less important about the exact content and more important about the method that you use to study the past. So, I mean, this graphic history approach, I think I tend to use it in the military history context because that's sort of where my education was. But through this group, Defining Moments Canada, I've also, like I mentioned, moved into labor history. I've moved into doing a project on Canadian Nobel Prize winners and the UN, anniversary UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I think that's just an example of that you can take something like graphic history and sort of use it to explore all sorts of different historical eras and times. The challenge I think you have as a teacher, and it's one that I had sort of as an instructor, was how to maybe assign that as something that can be graded. I didn't when I had the opportunity to teach. I used graphic history to sort of introduce the students, but I still fell back on a traditional paper that they would write, although with AI, chat GPT, maybe that needs to be reassessed as well. So I think that it's a good example of we need to reassess how students are evaluated, what kind of skills that we're teaching them. Is it important to write the traditional 10-page essay with footnotes and things, or are there other approaches that we can take? Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that in that
I've assigned graphic novels for my students to review, and I take kind of a two-stage approach. One is to review it as a book, but then also to review the history of the book. How well does it tell the story? Does it tell the story well? What liberties does it take in telling the story? And it works really well because the students' first reaction is always something really. So you kind of win them over right there, and they're doing work and they're learning in spite of themselves, and it works really well. I haven't taught First World War since your book's come out, but it would be top of the list for assigning for that kind of a project, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. I don't think you know this, but I was one of the peer reviewers on this project.
Okay.
I thought this was a fantastic book and had no problem passing it through, and think it's, I guess I'm just happy to have been a small part of getting it out.
Oh, much appreciated. Thank you.
Question I have for you, it's kind of two-part, is what was the toughest part to draw? Both technically, sort of from an artist's perspective, and then conceptually from where you're starting at.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose the toughest maybe is what's the balance that you should take when I sort of have a sort of rough cartoonish style. And so what's the balance that you should take of that type of artistic style and trying to depict the horror and the brutality as it actually was? You don't want to slip into sort of gratuitous violence for violence sake. At the same time, you still want to indicate this isn't a sanitized version of the war, that people were killed in very gruesome ways. And I tried to balance that. Maybe I went too far on the side of sanitized, I don't know. But I think conceptually, that was probably the most difficult challenge about how to balance depicting real people's experiences in this style. And technically, it was all tough. There was a lot of drawing. It was a fun project to do. I guess the toughest part is to say stop, to know when it's finished, because I could have kept going. There was a point where I redid almost every page to some degree, and looking back, maybe I wish I'd redone some other things too, but you just have to know when to say when.
Do you have another monograph like this in your back pocket?
I do. I can't talk about it yet because there's an announcement that has to be made. But yeah, I'm thinking about doing a sequel to it. Yes. Yeah.
This relates to kind of what was just asked, but you talked about your process in illustrating the history of Hill 70 and kind of the context around that. What were some other challenges you faced in actually illustrating source to kind of to illustration, source to illustration? What were some challenges you faced other than the ones you've already talked about?
Yeah, the challenges are sort of how to depict the scene as they might have seen it. The historical record doesn't necessarily keep track of, the war diary might say about what the weather was like, but that doesn't necessarily give you a full picture about what they would have experienced. So what I try to do is I try to balance that approach of realistic with a bit of abstract as well, to indicate that I'm not saying that this is exactly how someone would have experienced trench warfare, but this is instead an impression of how they might have. So the challenge of sources is, to take another example, not Hill 70. So I did another graphic comic for CMH on a Canadian officer who was deserted and he was cashiered and imprisoned in Normandy in 1944. And so it's something simple as, I know he's in Lake Superior Regiment, he's in a motorized infantry unit. It says in the war diary, his vehicle comes under fire and then he disappears. Well, what type of vehicle? Would it be just a carrier? Would it be a half-track? So, it's just a perfect example of you can't hide it. If it was text, you can sort of just say, he was in a vehicle, he was attacked, he fled. When you're drawing something, you have to make a choice. And so you make the choice, but you acknowledge that this is based on reasonable speculation.
Do you have any like process and when you're making those decisions about like if something's left out, like how do you kind of interpret what, like do you have any process when it comes to that kind of decision making?
The process, it's in part some sort of practical decision of that you can't just keep researching, hoping that you're going to find something. You just have to make a choice and stick with it. But I try to make sure that the image is suitable to convey the message that I want, and it's also connected to the text if I have text on that page. Yeah.
I just love that bottom illustration where it appears that you're looking through field glasses and you want to know what's going on, but you don't really want to be there.
Yeah. That comes from, there's a scene where it's not a poison gas attack, but tear gas attack. And so that's through the gas mask. Initially, McGill-Queen said a different cover design. This is the hardcover, by the way. The paperback is a different cover. But I thought, through their eyes, it seems like a good metaphor. Yes?
Which is your most successful panel, page?
That's a good question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I can be a little critical of my own work a little bit. The page that the bottom image comes from, I happen to like quite a bit. It's sort of a heavy action page with a lot of movements and the gas and everything. So I like how that turned out. There's parts of it of every image that I like, parts that I wish maybe could have been a bit better. But I would say that image and the one at the top where it's the map superimposed on the soldiers. There's a famous Hill 70 map, and it's all the troop movements and everything. And so I like how I've taken that map and imposed it on about 4 pages of soldiers from the battalions that the map describes. And I happen to like how that one turned out as well. Yeah, Ken.
Were you able to go over to Hill 70 to see the landscape and do the layout?
No, I haven't been to Hill 70, and so that's why a lot of what I depict is sort of it attempts to be from a personal perspective of what the soldiers would have seen, rather than necessarily from the grander strategic view. There's a little bit of that for the Currie chapter, but I try not to get into the geography of the entire battle, but instead focus on what individuals may have witnessed in sort of their confined perspective.
Did you make any composition changes when you were dealing with, say, Lee, who didn't know so much about, versus someone you had more source material? Or I think that's a great question, and there's not very many horizons here. It seems quite oppressive and enclosed. I'm just wondering if you consciously were making compositional choices in your construction based on those sorts of notions of where you were or who you were dealing with, or?
No, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the sort of factors that went into how I composed the scenes. So in Lee's case, it's both from his perspective, but as I mentioned, we have so limited sources that it's sort of from the battalion's perspective, and then Lee is also there as someone who likely witnessed what I'm depicting. Whereas with Chisholm, it's more from his direct perspective, because we have the words that he wrote about what he actually saw, and then sort of we can source that and document it. Yeah.
Do you feel that the kind of medium in which you're representing these soldiers' stories honors their kind of experiences more than the traditional kind of, I guess, just like literary form of like storytelling? History?
I hope so. I think it's a difficult balance. Some might disagree and think that it is sensationalizing in some way to illustrate someone's experiences. I think either approach work in sort of honoring someone's experience. In this case, I'm saying not definitively that this is how they witnessed something, but I'm at least depicting it. Whereas with the written approach, maybe there's an advantage of you write it and you leave it to the imagination of the reader to depict it in their own mind. So I'm sort of it's a difficult balance of sort of imposing this is one view. So I try to take a number of different perspectives throughout the book, but this is still one view as opposed to text, which maybe is more open to interpretation based on the reader's own way that they visualize what they read. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were 6 Canadian Victoria Cross winners in this campaign, in this battle. Is that a high preponderance of Victoria Crosses in one battle in the First World War?
It is for the Canadians. I think Vimy Ridge was 4, and so Hill 70. I'm not sure if it's the most in one battle. Depends on how sort of you count. Maybe the 100 Days campaign, but it was quite high, and I believe that 3 of them were posthumous.
That's my next question. So 3 were posthumous and
I believe so.
3 survived.
Yeah. And the ones that survived, they had sort of difficult lives after the fact. There was one, Michael O'Rourke, who was a stretcher bearer, won the Victoria Cross at Hill 70. And then later in life, through the Depression, falls on hard times, is involved in sort of socialist politics in BC in the 1930s. And then there's the most famous case of Philip Conowal, who's a Ukrainian Canadian, and he killed a dozen Germans in the battle, took the Victoria Cross, was shot in the head, which likely caused mental problems later on. He murdered someone in 1919, and then he ends up being the janitor at the House of Commons in the 1950s. Yeah?
You mentioned open to interpretation earlier, and it's got me thinking again about a traditional method versus the graphic history. And I guess my question is, when you sit down to write an article or a scholarly material, historians often have their argument planned out and ready to go. And it comes at you in an abstract and then is unpacked throughout an article, and you reach a clear conclusion. Did you, the creator, have that kind of thing in mind as you were putting this together, or is there a conclusion here, a historical conclusion, or is it open to interpretation? I'm going to read it first of all.
I appreciate that.
Am I?
No, I think that's a fair question. I think it's a different type of history book in that the chapters are connected, perhaps loosely connected, in that they're vignettes of people's experiences. It's also a product of how it was created. The Chisholm chapter and the Lee chapter originally were those 2 shorter booklets. And so I redid all the imagery, but it still follows sort of the same basic plots of those books. So the argument that is in the book is sort of the graphic approach itself. And so that's why I was quite insistent on making sure that we have a graphic introduction, which I talk about the idea of that photograph of going over the top that's in fact stitched together. And so if there's an argument, it's sort of in that introduction about how we are representing the past, what we think about a realistic depiction, because that's something I'm sensitive to as someone who is attempting to illustrate. There's always those historians who know specific details about what the uniforms might have looked like, what the rifles look like, what the helmets look like. And so they can pick up on when things are wrong. And so what that chapter is attempting to do is saying, so ask yourself, why is that particular detail important as opposed to other things which I'm depicting? So is a modernist abstract depiction any less realistic than a super photographically realistic one? So that's sort of the questions that chapter tries to provoke.
Thank you.
That about wraps it up. Thank you again, Carol, for filling all the questions.
Thanks.
Actually, working at McCrae House, there is a graphic novel with John McCrae called The Group of Seven that has like 7 Canadian heroes from the First World War with Billy Bishop and John McCrae and Francis Peg Magabo and amongst others, and it's kind of funny, but it's a little off kilter. But we have to have it at our gift shop because it has John McCrae. So.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something else about sort of distinguishing when I do graphic history from a graphic novel. I think graphic novel is useful. You can use it as a source or to analyze it. but graphic history is designed to be, there's fictive elements, but there's no sort of fictional dialogue or fictional characters or anything like that. So
Yeah, and this is meant to be entertaining. It's like they're like the superheroes kind of thing. It's fun. And I've only seen a couple. There's a whole series of them, and but I just wanted to mention that if you want to sign up for be reminded of these lectures, sign up at the front desk. And next month's lecture on Thursday, October 19th, is by Kyle Falcon, and it's on spirits, physics, and divination: how the Great War haunted the British Empire. So it's sort of on the occult and how spirits came around. I know he's got a book with it too. Yes?
A question. So if one couldn't make one of the live talks, I thought I read that it was on Facebook.
Yeah, we've got it being recorded right now.
Great.
Chris is at the back, doing a great job. So thank you all for coming out, and hopefully we see you again next month.
thanks.
Thanks again.
Thank you.